Evelyn had always valued her home as a sanctuary, a place of peace and comfort where she and her husband, David, could build their lives together. They had a quiet routine, each taking care of their responsibilities, and she felt content. That is, until the day David announced a major change without consulting her. "Evelyn, I've invited my sister Julie to stay with us for a while," he said casually over dinner one evening, his tone suggesting he expected her approval without question. Evelyn's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Without asking me first." She tried to keep her voice calm, but inside she felt a wave of unease. "Julie's going through a rough time," David continued, almost dismissively. "She needs a place to stay, and I thought, why not? We have enough room." Evelyn had always known David was protective of his younger sister, but she hadn't anticipated that he'd make such a decision without even discussing it with her. Although she didn't want to appear unsupportive, the idea of Julie moving in didn't sit well with her. Julie had a reputation in the family for being entitled and dependent, rarely taking on responsibility. A few days later, Julie arrived with her luggage and an air of entitlement, as if the house was now hers to command. She didn't bother offering to help with household chores or even show a basic courtesy towards Evelyn, who welcomed her despite her reservations. Instead, Julie settled into the house, filling up spaces and treating herself to the comforts that Evelyn had carefully maintained. At first, Evelyn tried to be patient. She hoped that Julie would eventually realize she couldn't stay indefinitely without contributing in some way. But weeks went by, and Julie continued her routine of leisure and disregard, spending hours on her phone or watching TV without lifting a finger to help. One evening, Evelyn approached David in the kitchen, carefully choosing her words. "David, don't you think it's time Julie contributes around here? She's been here for weeks, and it feels like I'm the only one keeping things in order." David shrugged, brushing off her concerns. "She's just going through a phase. She'll get back on her feet soon. But it's starting to feel like I'm the only one making an effort to keep things running smoothly," Evelyn insisted, trying to make him understand her perspective. David sighed, clearly irritated. "Evelyn, it's just temporary. Can't you show a little patience?" Evelyn bit her lip, sensing that David was unwilling to see the issue from her perspective. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep quiet forever. Her patience was wearing thin, and sooner or later, something would have to give. As days turned into weeks, Julie continued her carefree lifestyle with no regard for the household responsibilities. Evelyn found herself growing increasingly frustrated. Julie would leave her dishes in the sink, scatter her belongings across the living room, and lounge around all day while Evelyn managed the house. One evening, Evelyn returned home from a long day at work to find the kitchen in disarray. Takeout boxes and dirty plates were stacked on the counter, and the trash overflowed. Evelyn sighed, exhausted and irritated, as she started to clean up. As she washed the dishes, she heard footsteps behind her. Julie sauntered in, a smug smile on her face. "Oh, Evelyn, you didn't have to clean that up. I was going to get to it eventually," she said with a dismissive wave. Evelyn held back a sharp retort, forcing herself to stay calm. "It would be nice if you helped out a little around here, Julie. You've been staying with us for a while now." Julie rolled her eyes. "Look, I'm going through a lot. I don't need to add cleaning to my plate right now. Besides, David didn't say anything about helping with chores." At that moment, David walked in, sensing the tension in the room. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between the two women. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to explain. "David, I've been handling everything here, and it's getting exhausting. Julie doesn't help out at all, and it feels like she doesn't respect our space." David's expression shifted to one of annoyance. "Evelyn, she's family. We're supposed to support her, not make her feel unwelcome." Julie crossed her arms and added, "Exactly. Maybe Evelyn's just not used to having to share her precious house." Evelyn felt a pang of frustration but chose to bite her tongue, knowing it wasn't the right time to push back further. She felt trapped, alone in her own home, as her concerns seemed invisible to David. Later that night, Evelyn lay awake, thinking about the distance growing between her and David. She wondered if he truly understood how much the situation was affecting her, or if he had become so wrapped up in protecting his sister that he no longer saw her perspective. But as the days passed, Evelyn began to realize that she couldn't keep holding everything in. She would have to stand up for herself, even if it meant challenging David's loyalty to his sister. She just wasn't sure how he would react, or if he would even listen. The tension between Evelyn and Julie was becoming unbearable. Despite Evelyn's quiet attempts to keep the peace, her patience was running out. Julie's behavior had only gotten worse. She was dismissive, entitled, and made no effort to be a considerate guest. What bothered Evelyn the most was that David seemed blind to all of it. He defended his sister at every turn, leaving Evelyn to shoulder the burden of the home alone. One afternoon, after coming home from a tiring workday, Evelyn found herself in the kitchen preparing dinner, only to be interrupted by Julie walking in, asking what was for dinner, as though she hadn't noticed the effort Evelyn was putting into every meal. "Don't you think you should at least help out in the kitchen?" Evelyn asked, frustration creeping into her voice. Julie looked up from her phone, barely acknowledging the question. "I'm not in the mood to cook. You know I'm not good at it. You've got it covered, right?" Evelyn clenched her fists, trying to control her anger. "That's not the point, Julie. You've been here for weeks and haven't lifted a finger. You don't help with anything around the house. It's becoming too much." At that moment, David walked in, sensing the tension. He immediately put his hand on Julie's shoulder, as if to shield her. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice sharp. Evelyn could feel the weight of his gaze, but she was done holding back. "David, I've tried to be patient, but this is ridiculous. Julie has been living here for weeks, and she does nothing. I'm the one doing all the work. I'm getting tired of it." David's expression faltered for a moment, but then his tone shifted. "Evelyn, I told you. She's family. You need to be more understanding. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" Evelyn's heart raced. She couldn't believe he was still defending his sister after everything that had happened. "I'm making a big deal because I'm the one doing everything. You don't see what's going on behind the scenes. Julie just sits around while I handle everything, and you won't even listen to me when I ask for help." David's face reddened. "Don't start accusing me of not supporting you. I'm trying to help, but you need to be more patient with her. She's going through a tough time." Evelyn shook her head, feeling the weight of the conversation press down on her. She had been patient, more patient than anyone should be, and it wasn't working. She was tired of feeling invisible in her own home. "I've been patient, David, but patience has its limits. You've been so focused on Julie that you've forgotten about me, about us." David opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence only fueled Evelyn's frustration. She took a deep breath and stood up straighter, meeting his eyes. "I'm not going to let this continue. If you can't see what's happening here, then maybe I need to start thinking about what I want, not just what everyone else wants," she said firmly, her voice shaking with determination. For a moment, the room was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. Evelyn's words hung in the air, and the realization of how deep the rift had grown between them was impossible to ignore. David didn't speak for a long time, and Evelyn could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had said what needed to be said, and now she would wait for him to respond. She wasn't sure if things could be fixed, but she was finally ready to take control of her own happiness. She turned and left the kitchen, leaving David standing there, speechless. It was time for her to decide what came next. The days that followed were tense and uncertain. Evelyn had spoken her mind, but David hadn't responded the way she had hoped. He remained distant, avoiding difficult conversations. Julie, on the other hand, continued to make herself comfortable, as if nothing had changed. Evelyn could feel herself slipping into a state of frustration that she hadn't experienced before. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a battleground. One evening, as Evelyn sat alone in the living room, she heard Julie's loud voice echoing from the kitchen. "David, I think we should go out tonight. I'm so tired of being cooped up in here all the time." Evelyn clenched her jaw, the words cutting deeper than she expected. Julie had never once offered to help with anything, but she was always the first to demand attention and special treatment. David's silence in these moments only made it worse. A few minutes later, David walked into the living room, his face tight with unease. "Evelyn, we need to talk." Evelyn stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing. "What's there to talk about, David? I've already told you how I feel. You've been prioritizing Julie over me, and I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." David's face reddened as he ran a hand through his hair. "I never meant for things to get so complicated. But you have to understand, Julie is my sister. I don't want to see her struggle, and I thought you'd be more supportive." "I am supportive," Evelyn snapped, her voice thick with emotion. "But you're ignoring everything I've been going through. I've been patient, I've been understanding, but I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with this." David hesitated, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry, Evelyn. I didn't see how much this was affecting you. I should have noticed sooner." Evelyn felt a pang of sadness, mixed with relief. It was the first time in a long while that David had acknowledged her feelings. But even then, it didn't erase the toll the situation had taken on her. She had been so patient, so accommodating, and now she wasn't sure if she could go back to how things were. "I don't know if I can just let this go, David," Evelyn said, her voice faltering. "I've been living in a situation where I feel like I don't matter, and I can't keep going like this." David stepped closer, his voice softer. "What do you need from me, Evelyn? How can I fix this?" Evelyn paused, considering her options. The weight of the decision felt heavy in her chest. She loved David, but she couldn't continue sacrificing her own well-being for the sake of his sister's comfort. It was time to take action, to choose what was best for her. "I need space," she said finally. "I need you to make a choice, David. You need to decide if you're going to put your marriage first, or if you're going to keep letting Julie dictate everything." David's face fell, but Evelyn could see the shift in his eyes. It wasn't easy for him, but he was starting to understand the gravity of the situation. "I don't want to lose you, Evelyn," David said quietly. "I'll talk to Julie. I'll make things right. But please don't give up on us." Evelyn sighed deeply, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep living like this. She deserved to feel valued, respected, and loved. And if David was willing to fight for their marriage, then perhaps there was hope. "I'm not giving up on us," she said softly. "But things need to change. For both of us." As David nodded in agreement, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. She wasn't sure how everything would unfold, but she was ready to take control of her own happiness, no matter the outcome. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally making the right decision for herself. The next few days were tense as David took it upon himself to have a serious conversation with Julie. Evelyn could hear their voices from the other room, but the words were muffled, and she couldn't quite make them out. Part of her wanted to eavesdrop, to know exactly what was being said, but another part of her knew that this had to be David's decision to make. She had said what needed to be said. Now it was his turn to act. Evelyn spent those days trying to focus on herself. She went for walks in the park, something she hadn't done in a while, and allowed herself to reconnect with her own thoughts. She realized that she had been so consumed with trying to keep the peace and make everyone happy that she had neglected her own needs. She was reminded of something her mother had once told her. "You can't pour from an empty cup." And in that moment, Evelyn understood. She had been giving and giving, but she had stopped taking care of herself. It was time to change that. When David came home that evening, he seemed worn out, but there was a sense of resolve in his eyes. "I talked to Julie," he said quietly, sitting down beside her on the couch. "She doesn't understand why I'm upset, but I told her she needs to pull her weight around here. I also made it clear that I can't keep neglecting our marriage for the sake of her comfort." Evelyn nodded slowly, taking in his words. She didn't know if it was enough, but it was a start. "What did she say?" "She was defensive at first," David admitted, "but I think she's starting to get it. I told her she can't live here without contributing. I need to prioritize our home, Evelyn. I understand now that you've been carrying the burden alone. Evelyn felt a mix of emotions. She appreciated that David had finally stepped up, but part of her still felt the weight of everything she had been through. She had endured a lot in silence, and even though David was making the right decision now, she wasn't sure if she could just forget the way things had been. David, she said after a long pause, I'm glad you talked to her, but I need you to know something. I can't just go back to how things were. I can't keep pretending like I'm okay when I'm not. David reached for her hand, his voice sincere. I understand, Evelyn. I've been selfish and I'm sorry. I know I have a lot of work to do to earn your trust back, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Evelyn squeezed his hand, looking into his eyes. I need to see real change, David. Not just promises but actions. We both need to work on this marriage, not just me. David nodded. His eyes filled with determination. A promise, Evelyn. I'll prove to you that I can be the husband you deserve. The room fell into a comfortable silence, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a sense of peace. She wasn't sure how long it would take for things to fully heal, but she knew that this was a step in the right direction. She had stood up for herself, and David was starting to listen. As the days passed, Julie gradually began to help out around the house, and the tension between her and Evelyn began to ease. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of discomfort, but things were improving. David and Evelyn also made more time for each other, reconnecting in ways they hadn't in a long time. They started to rebuild the trust and communication that had been damaged. Evelyn realized that she had taken the most important step of all. She had chosen herself. She had chosen her happiness, her peace of mind, and her worth. And in doing so, she had taken control of her life once again. As she sat with David one evening, sharing a quiet moment, she knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful about the future. Together, they were beginning to rebuild not just their home, but their marriage. And Evelyn was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that she was stronger than ever. Weeks passed, and the changes that Evelyn had hoped for began to take root. Julie, though initially resistant, started to show more respect for the boundaries Evelyn had set. She began contributing around the house, and while she didn't exactly become the ideal houseguest, the dynamic between her and Evelyn had shifted. It was no longer the uncomfortable, tense atmosphere it once was. David, too, was doing his part. He came home early some evenings to cook dinner, something Evelyn had always wished for, but had been too busy herself to ask. They would sit at the dinner table talking about their day, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt heard. She no longer had to carry the weight of their relationship alone. One Friday evening after a long workweek, David came to Evelyn with a surprise. I made reservations at that Italian restaurant you've been wanting to go to, he said, his face bright with excitement. I figured we could have a date night, just the two of us. Evelyn's heart warmed at his gesture. It had been so long since they had spent time alone, without distractions or outside pressures. That sounds perfect, she said, her smile genuine. As they sat at the restaurant, laughing over their meal and reconnecting, Evelyn felt a sense of calm wash over her. She realized that their relationship, although strained, had found a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for her that was enough. Later that evening, as they walked hand in hand back to their car, David stopped her, his expression serious. Evelyn, I want you to know that I am really trying. I know I've messed up, but I want to make this work. You mean everything to me. Evelyn looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. It wasn't just words. She could feel the effort he was putting into this new chapter of their life. I know you are, David, she replied softly. And I want this to work too. But we both have to keep working at it. Relationships are about growth, and we've both changed. We're not the same people we were before. David nodded, taking her hand more firmly. I'm ready for that. I'll be here with you every step of the way. Evelyn smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was no longer afraid of the future. She had found her voice, stood up for what she deserved, and in doing so, had given herself the chance for a healthier, more balanced life. Back home, as they entered the front door, they found Julie sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. She glanced up at them, offering a half-smile. "You guys have fun." "We did," Evelyn said, her tone light. "Thanks for keeping things together here." Julie raised an eyebrow, as if trying to gauge the sincerity behind her words. "Yeah, well, don't expect me to become a full-time maid or anything." Evelyn chuckled, the tension that used to exist between them now more manageable. "We'll figure it out, Julie. But let's keep working on being respectful of each other's space." Julie nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable, but she didn't argue. It was a start. Evelyn and David walked to their room, the house feeling quieter, more peaceful than it had in a long time. As she lay in bed that night, Evelyn reflected on everything that had happened, the frustrations, the confrontations, the tears. But through it all, she had remained true to herself. She had fought for her happiness, for her peace of mind, and for the relationship that she still valued. The road to reconciliation was not always easy, but Evelyn knew that the journey had been worth it. She was stronger than ever, not just for herself, but for the life she was building with David. And though there would still be challenges ahead, she was ready to face them, knowing she was no longer alone in this fight. As sleep finally took her, Evelyn smiled to herself. The storm had passed, and the sun was beginning to shine once again.